All right, well, we're going to talk about the trade talks in a bit more detail later on in the programme. But first of all, let's take a look at the front pages, because they are mostly dominated by one story. The Daily Telegraph: a freed terrorist strikes again. We can move on to The Guardian, who covers it like this: terror attacker freed from jail and on police watch list. And the Daily Mail has this as its headline, which is "Why did they let him out?" And this is about a 20-year-old Sudesh Aman, who was automatically released halfway through his jail sentence in January and then went on to stab a number of people on Streatham High Road yesterday. There he is. Let's talk to Gordon Corera, the BBC's security correspondent, and actually put that question to Gordon R., who seems to be... He's not quite ready yet, actually. But this chap, Sudesh Aman, was under active police surveillance at the time of the attack. So there are questions about why he was released and why it was necessary then to have him under surveillance. Bim, are you reassured by the changes that were made in the light of the London Bridge terror attack when this has happened within 2 months?
Well, I think we need to do more. And my understanding is that later on today, the Home Secretary will set out what further measures. But, you know, this government isn't satisfied with the position that it's in. That's why, in fact, I asked the Prime Minister's question about it. You know, we need longer sentences, we need an end to early release, and we need to boost the counter-terrorism support. That's not just money, that's also people, and that's what we're doing. But this obviously is not, you know, in a place where the Prime Minister or anybody in the government wants it to be. That's why we need to have further measures, and I look forward to hearing what the Home Secretary has to say later on today. All
right, well, let's listen to what the Prime Minister had to say on this very subject. Here he is.
What we want to do is to make sure that people convicted of terrorist act offences are not let out without some process of parole or scrutiny by real experts in the matter, cynical, hardened people who can look into their eyes and really think whether or not these people, again, pose a danger to the public.
Boris Johnson talking just a few moments ago, in fact. Let's catch up now with Gordon Corera, security correspondent. Why was this man let out?
He was let out because he'd reached the point where he'd served half his sentence, and under the existing rules, that's what happens. Clearly, it happened even though there was a degree of concern about him, quite a high degree of concern. I mean, everyone who's let out is subject to investigation and to checks by MI5 and the police, but certainly not everyone is subject to armed covert surveillance on them, and that certainly suggests that this was someone who was considered high risk and a potential threat to life. Now, that may be partly based on his original behaviour before he was convicted, where he had a kind of fixation with knives, perhaps also what he was like in prison, and perhaps behaviour after prison. But you put that together, and clearly this was someone they were worried about, but they had to release and therefore had a surveillance team on. Without that surveillance team on him, this could have been worse, because they were able to deal with him within seconds of him launching his attack.
Explain to us what exactly automatic early release is and means in practice. I mean, how much time does an offender then serve in prison?
Well, an offender will normally serve half of the time they are sentenced to in prison, but that will also potentially include the time they spent on remand in the run-up, so it can be slightly less than half after their actual conviction and sentencing. And I think that is where there is a lot of focus now, whether anything can be done about this. Certainly the government has talked about in the last couple of weeks about new legislation for the future, about changing that, about different types of sentencing, about different types of checks on people. But one of the real challenges is those who are already out or who are due to come out under the existing system. And one of the challenges is that normally you can't pass that kind of legislation retrospectively to deal with those issues, with those people, and there are thought to be a couple of hundred Islamist terrorist-related individuals who are in jail at the moment, in prison.
Right, and what do you make of this statement that has been released, Islamic State group claiming responsibility for the knife attack, saying the perpetrator was a fighter of the group?
Well, this is something they tend to do. I mean, we do know with this individual, he did appear to have pledged his allegiance a few years ago, and he seemed to have some kind of allegiance 2 years ago when he was originally convicted of those offences, and he was convicted for possessing and disseminating propaganda linked to the group. So clearly there was some affiliation on his part, but they do often issue these statements after an attack. That's what they often do, even if there was no actual contact with an individual. They, if you like, try to associate themselves with what someone has done. So I think one of the issues the police and MI5 will be looking at is, did he have any kind of contacts in that week or so between his release from prison and his carrying out this attack? Were there any kind of warning signs there or any kind of contact that might be suspicious? But clearly they were worried about him, to have him under that level of surveillance.
All right, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but Gordon Carrera, thank you very much. I'm going to welcome Dr. Paul Scott, who's joined us here in the studio, research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, and warned police not to release Sudesh Amman back in December. Why?
Well, he was one of a group of individuals who we'd identified whose release we thought was imminent. I think if you look at the details of his case, the publicly available material on the Crown Prosecution Service website, and indeed on the BBC's reporting of the case, this was somebody who pledged allegiance to Islamic State, who was using encryption, who had younger siblings who he'd been sending Al-Qaeda and Islamic State material to. And we had, I think, grave reservations about whether in such a short space of time, you know, he was sentenced in 2018, in such a short space of time, could such a person lose that vigour and vim that he had for the cause that he espoused? I
mean, Ian, people will be astounded that somebody who had shown no remorse and was still sort of pledging allegiance to Islamic State was let out at all.
Exactly, it's incomprehensible to most people, but clearly there needs to be changes in the law. I mean, the simple way through this would be to say that anybody who pledges allegiance to IS is put in prison indefinitely. Now, that would legally, I mean, that would create an unfortunate precedent in many ways, but we are in an age of without precedent at the moment. But part of the problem also is we've had 7 different justice secretaries over the last 10 years. Now think about that. They're in office for an average of less than 18 months. Now, in the end, if you're a politician and you keep being moved on and then your successor comes in, spent 6 months learning themselves into the job, how on earth are you going to get a grip on this, let alone prison reform?
Well, on that, I hope the current Justice Secretary stays in post. And I think he's a very, very good Justice Secretary. But the broader point here is we do need to learn the lessons when things happen. On some level, we can't talk about what was done 5 years ago or 10 years ago. The Prime Minister has been crystal clear, not just in public, but in private as well, about the need to absolutely get on top of this and do whatever we can.
But David
within
Cameron
the law,
said that, Theresa May said that,
and we've just
Boris
got to go
Johnson
further.
Is saying it. How can the public have confidence that after 10 years the government is actually going to do something?
Well, all I can say is that we've backed up what we've said rhetorically and in the campaign in the general election with action, and we're going to take more action soon, as the Home Secretary will set out. But look, I hear your frustration and I share it myself.
I think Ian's hit the nail on the head in that this isn't just about what the Justice Secretary is saying or what the Prime Minister is saying. Our whole criminal justice system needs a whole-scale review. It's not fit for purpose. We need to go back one step and look at what is happening to these young men and women whilst they're in prison. Yeah. It's not about when they come out. For a number of them, they're being re-radicalised whilst they're in prison. A number of the services, which is looking at the rehabilitation of these people whilst they're in prison, has been cut to the bare minimum. It's not working. Then we wonder why when they're let out early, which again is legally the law, they then commit these offences.
And you can't rehabilitate someone in 18 months. It's just not possible. Short sentences do not work.
Right, so what sort of resources will be needed then to actually de-radicalise and rehabilitate the sort of people like this man? And how will you know?
Well, that's one of the big challenges. I think it's significant that we spent so much time debating the issue of returning fighters from Syria, people who'd gone out to join Islamic State, and we perhaps missed this upcoming car crash, really, of the people who were being released from prison. It was clear in 2018 there was a bit of a quirk in terms of a very large number of people were due to be released 2018, 2019, and as has been said, there seems to have been very little progress. The prison system has been in chaos for some years. We need to be perfectly clear about that. I think historically religion was seen as an inherent good within the prison system. That may not be the case with some of the stripes of very extreme Islam, which some people are taking into the prison system, having been convicted, supporters of Islamic State, supporters of Al-Qaeda. Those people appear, in some cases, to be proselytising to others.
Can I ask a question? My understanding is that we know that there are 200 odd who are about to be released or entitled to be released soon, and 70 odd who are out there on licence. Isn't it legally, I don't know, what can the government do at this point? Because don't you need evidence of something in order to put these people back in prison? You can't just undo years and years of law immediately.
No, and obviously the way the British legal system works, and arguably correctly, we can't start applying things retrospectively. I think there's a lot of value in Ian's suggestion in terms of where people have pledged allegiance to a group like Islamic State, of having a treason law and a long sentence for treason that's going to take these people out of circulation for some years.
Do you agree with that? Because this issue of surveillance is interesting. People will also think, why release someone and then spend all the resources putting them under surveillance because you clearly think there is still an issue? But is it about getting evidence together in the way Laura says, to then charge them again to put them back in prison?
So there are two parts to this. In relation to sentences, I think it's much easier if we have longer sentences and an end to early release. And therefore, when people are in prison, they can't do anything. But the second point you made about how we, with regards to our, whether it's a human rights legislation and various other pieces of legislation which cut across this, we can't just necessarily decide to lock up people retrospectively indefinitely. That just isn't something the government can do. But we are going to have to take
It could do it. I'm not saying it should, but it could do it. You can pass any law you like. You've got a majority of 80.
That is true. What I'm saying is one has to make sure that whatever we do doesn't cut across, something else. But we need to see everything we can do, and I'm sure there are government lawyers at this very moment thinking, what is it that we can do that we can make sure that those 200 people do not have the opportunity to do anything at all?
What you could do, and what I'd hope the government will do, is make sure that the Met Police and other police forces are fully resourced, so that then if they are tasked with surveilling these criminals when they're out on early release, they can do that. At the moment, we have a police force in London who are having to, look at so many issues in our capital. And the fact is, if they were properly resourced in other areas, I think, we would have that closer surveillance. They are being surveilled.
It was happening with
but one of the things is that...
But even if you're under surveillance, that doesn't mean that you'll necessarily be able to stop every attack, as was proved in this case.
And that is always the point, isn't it? If someone is that determined, then they will obviously go ahead and try to commit the crime, whatever protection there is around them. But let's go to the issue of whether they should be released, because the government, in the light of the London Bridge attack, did say that automatic early release would be stopped, but only for violent offenders. And in this case, Sudesh Arman, I understand, was only looking at, when I say only, but looking at extremist material. Should that now be extended to cover people like him?
Well, I wonder if that is what Priti Patel is going to stand up and say this afternoon. It's almost problematic for the government that we just had an attack in November. They promised a whole raft of legislation, and for it to then happen again, I know that new legislation hasn't actually come into force yet. I think it's coming to the Commons in mid-March, so there might be some public sympathy with that, but it does feel as though they're going to have to say something this afternoon, but I don't know exactly what they can do because of how difficult it is to go back and undo.
The other point is, often in these situations, if you legislate in haste, you repent at your leisure. Yeah. I think announcing definite measures within 24 hours of a terror attack, I mean, wait to see what she says, but I'm always suspicious of anybody that wants to react in a knee-jerk way in these circumstances.
Well, and you were echoing Louise Haigh, your colleague, who has said that every chance the attacker left in prison will be even more dangerous when he's let out than if he stays, or sorry, if you cut the sentence. It's even worse if they're in prison for longer because of the radicalisation. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't, because the most important thing is that people are in prison so they can't harm the public. That is of primary importance. So the idea that somehow them being longer in prison is somehow worse, I don't agree with that at all.
What do you say about that? Because if they are radicalised, then they can come out in an even more sort of severe way than they went in.
That was certainly one of the problems historically, if you remember the Northern Ireland conflict, that their people were able to organise within their groups and reproduce their group ideology within prison. I think we're seeing some worrying indications from within our high security prisons that is happening to an extent now. and it's quite likely we're going to have to move towards a much stricter set of dispersals for prisoners. And the difficulty is, of course, if you isolate prisoners totally, in the long term that becomes a human rights issue, becomes a mental health issue. But to stop them proselytising within the wider prison system is essential to stop them radicalising others.
Right, but isolation seems to be the only way you can actually do that. I mean, would that work?
Well, if we want to go down the road of being a state where we lock up people in solitary confinement for 10 years, fine, but I don't think many of us would want to do that.
I don't think that's going to solve this, and I think this is a complex issue. And you know, you've rightly said this isn't something where we have a knee-jerk reaction in terms of legislation, but looking at all the different arms, whether it's the judiciary service, the probation service, you know, the policing arm, prison service, all of that, they need to feed in whatever the government are going to do.
The difficulty with saying we need to avoid knee-jerk reactions, the first arrests of jihadists in Britain were in 1998. You know, we're a long way down this road. We're in the third or fourth decade now of this type of conflict, and it's going to endure. It's going to be with us for a long time.
Possibly we have to accept that there is no solution to this. There is no single measure or raft of measures that will prevent everybody carrying out some sort of terror attack. Now, this one, nobody's died in it. They did in London Bridge. But it's interesting that the sort of, I hesitate to use the word phrase comparatively minor, but compared to bombings, they are. I think we're going to see a lot more of these more minor attacks rather than the sort of the big attack that we've been used to in the past.
And just one thing worth saying, the police performed exceptionally well in this instance. You know, what they were able to do, and we should just make the point of saying,
but is that sustainable? Is it sustainable to cover and survey all these people that they have to monitor in the way they did with this man?
Well, the answer would it's really an individual by individual basis. It would depend on, because not everybody is the same. So, and in terms of one thing that I'd like to see in terms of in the legislation, when the detail of it comes out in the coming weeks and months, and what the Home Secretary says later on today, is giving, as we've done a boost of 90 million for counter-terrorism and the staff and the money. We've got to be able to make sure that that enables individual by individual, case by case judgments. Because one of the difficulties is it's so complicated because every individual has a different background and set of experience. So we need to make sure we've got enough support that we can make those case by case judgments in the right way. Sometimes surveillance is the right idea. Sometimes locking them up for a very, very long time is the right idea.
Just 200 people about to come out of prison. We're talking about 20,000 radical Islamists who've been identified by the security services. Now, there is no way that any government could provide the resources to have surveillance for 20,000 people. It's just not going to happen.
What's the mood like on the streets in the area?
We locally in Lambeth and in Streatham, an area I know very well. I went to secondary school there. I've walked up and down that high street for the best part of 5 years, and we're a strong community, we're a resilient community, and the mood on the ground is that we will not let this divide us. Locally, where that attack happened, there's the South London Liberal Synagogue, there's a mosque further down the road, there's a big church. You know, we're a mixed community. And just to thank the police, the ambulance services, my colleague, Belrabira Addy, the local MP, and Lambeth Council, in providing that reassurance to the people of Streatham.
All right, thank you. Paul Scott, thank you very much for coming in. Let's move on to the